Alright, well hey everyone, welcome to Red vs. Blue, the Untold Chapter. Thanks for attending, and you got myself, Aaron Herndon here, and then Tom. A little bit about ourselves. Aaron, I'm a security consultant with Rapid7. My primary areas of focus are social engineering. I like to do a lot of payload development, ESE type stuff. Also do some physical and electronic. My little awkward picture there, picking a door. Then red teaming. I do a lot of red team type operations, more on the covert side. And then Internet of Things. I'm not as much of a hardware guy, but I'll dig into a lot of hardware-based items and work with teammates to get firmware pulled. But after that, I'll start doing a lot of the reversing of the firmware, how things work. And so those are kind of where my passions lie.
Tom Somerville, security engineer at Gordon Food Service over on the other side of the state. InfoSec engineer, pretty standard run-of-the-mill, blue team stuff. Don't do a whole lot with risk compliance or anything like that. No social media or anything like that. Pretty much stay off the internet when I'm not at work. So if you want to get in touch with me, just meet me after and I'll get you my contact info.
All right. So this talk is going to focus really on a single attack chain, and we thought about doing a bunch of different red team type operations and then how blue team could detect them, but there's so much to cover. We really wanted to focus on something basic, single attack chain, where I as the attacker am going to breach into a simulated network, and then Tom as the defender is going to threat hunt that. We're going to use basic tools, open source tools. I'm not going to be using any of the custom toolkits we've written, just keeping it simple with what you could use out there, from my perspective at least, and then he's going to use an EDR. But it's going to be, that basic back and forth. There's going to be some intentional OPSEC fails on the red team side, so we can point those out along the way, so that, can help improve red teamers. And then from the blue team side, those OPSEC fails are also going to help him with, doing better threat hunting there and understanding what's going on.
Yeah, so really the intent here is that if you're thinking about doing threat hunting or you're just spinning up this type of program at your organization, this would be a really good exercise or something similar to this. Also, we wanted to focus on using a really limited tool set. In fact, pretty much everything we do here is done with one tool in EDR. There's a lot of options out there, but they mostly will be able to allow you to perform exercises like this. We're not going to go into a lot of the post-incident analysis due to time. When we first ran through it, 3 hours, so we had to knock it down a little bit. So here you go.
All right. So Wednesday evening, we got SpongeBob transitions to help us out. And so late Wednesday afternoon, red team comes along. Our target company is Bezink. That's the company we're going to be looking at. So first thing as a red team, I need to do some open source intelligence gathering. Who is this company? What do they have out there exposed? What's their external attack surface? And is there anything worth using to get into? Can I avoid phishing? Sometimes phishing, while it's nice, can burn all of your C2 infra, and you have to spend a lot of time setting up new C2 infrastructure. So if we can get in without it, it's nice. But so we do our OSINT. We're looking at ARIN records, finding out what this company has registered for IP space, Shodan, what ports and services they have running on the internet without actually actively scanning, some LinkedIn reconnaissance, connectdata.com, or document metadata to get some usernames and company info, employee names. Then Google dorking, find subdomains out there, what they might be running on sites, see if we can find like a VPN portal or a Citrix portal, something interesting. And after all that, we might switch to active reconnaissance. From an external perspective, I might stand up a burner box in AWS or some kind of cloud platform that I can just blast their network with and scan. If that gets caught by the blue team, they ban the IP, no harm, no foul, it was my burner box. I can stand up another one. I mean, people are getting hammered on the internet all the time. Your goal is not to have attribution linked back to you. But at the end of all my reconnaissance, my active and passive reconnaissance, does Bezink even do business? Are they a shell company? I found nothing. I found a few employees out there, and not a whole lot to go off of. One thing we did find though, they have Office 365. We used a tool called SpoofCheck to basically we were looking at SPF records, seeing what they had configured for their domain, and it says they're allowing mail from spfprotectionoutlook.com with a soft fail for all. So okay, they're using Office 365. Maybe we can get into that portal and use it a little bit more. Fun fact about Office 365, permits username enumeration. Another fun fact is that admins like to neglect their Office 365 logs. It's pretty hard to get all of them into a centralized logging. And even once you do, Office 365, their logging capabilities, unless you fine-tune them, out of the box, there's no great way to correlate things like password sprays. You can see it in an IP trying to log in a bunch of times, but you can't correlate to, oh, did they successfully log in to the portal or not when they're spraying usernames against a single password. So that's what we're going to do. Build a user list, enumerate against the portal for valid users, password spray, and profit off of it. So first thing, we need a user list. We had already scraped LinkedIn to get some usernames, but there wasn't a lot out there. So I switched to using Burp Suite as a CO2 plugin, and they have inside CO2 is a user generator. You can take census data and generate a list of common first names and last names and put them into any format. So here we took a bunch of census data from the 1950s to 1990s for first names, and then the top 20% of surnames in the United States. Put them together, made a list of first initial last name, appended the @Bezinc email at the end, and now we have our list to spray with. Office 365, again, permits user enumeration. So if I were to use the tool Office 365 user enum, basically it tries to log into the portal using ActiveSync. And ActiveSync, when you're logging in, if you get a 404 not found, the user you tried to log in with was an invalid user. Take them out of your list. They're not in that, or they're not in O365. 403 forbidden. Cool, you logged in with username and password, but you had 2FA. Okay, nothing you can do there. Well, unless you 2FA fish. 200, okay, valid cred, success, you're in the portal. And 401, unauthorized, you now know you have a valid username but an invalid password. So after your first spray, come back through with valid usernames again, and only use your valid usernames, because obviously there's no sense in spraying with invalid. And so here we have Smith J was a valid user. But so one thing I like to do is spray season, year. Users love season, year. Why? Because you have password requirements that change every 90 days. And what changes every 90 days? The season. So people do this all the time. Pretty common if you have a large employee base to find somebody using a password in that nature. So we try summer 2018 exclamation point with our email list against the Office 365 portal. And we find this guy, Payne C, maybe like Chris Payne or something, has a weak password for summer 2018 exclamation point. So now we have email access. What are we going to do with that? Well, the tool ruler we can use to go ahead and dump the GAL or global address list, get a list of all employees there. We can also go through the email address or the email account and start looking for sensitive information, passwords. We don't really find any of that. And so instead we're going to use this email account as a springboarding platform to basically spearfish with a harpoon gun. We're inside someone's email. We can send trusted emails to the company. We know what their email headers look like. I mean, it's pretty easy to simulate this employee at this point and send maybe a payload that's going to get us internal network access. So digging around, we find that Chris Payne and Paul Melson actually happen to be pretty old, and they're going to be retiring. And so if anyone knows these two people, there's a lot of jokes for them. But yeah, they're going to be retiring, and so there was a retirement celebration sent out. And with their retirement celebration, they were just saying, hey, we're going to Founders, we're going to meet up, whoever wants to join us. Well, we think, okay, here's an invite. What if we replied back to everyone as Chris Payne, since we're in his account, saying, here's an evite. We need you to open an RSVP if you're going to attend. So that's what we do. We start crafting this evite that's going to use a payload for people to open and say, yeah, we're going to come to your party. Some assumptions before we start crafting our payload, though. Just basic assumptions I'm going to make because I haven't done a lot of recon to figure out what their hosts are like. I'm going to go with probably have some sort of next-gen AV running. I'm going to say AppLocker is going to prevent the execution of unsigned binaries. PowerShell is going to be disabled or heavily logged if they're on v5 or above. And then Windows 10 with ASR, attack surface reduction rules. That's going to prevent me from executing some of my COM objects or interacting with maybe wscript.shell, things like that outside of or inside of a Word macro. So it's going to take away using Office documents there to be able to get a successful fish unless I could find a bypass for it. What does that leave me with? Well, we're going to hope HTML applications work. What is an HTA? Just a little bit about that. It's basically it's been around in Windows for a while, and it's run by mshta.exe, which is Microsoft signed binary. It runs HTML code, but it does it outside of the Internet Explorer sandbox. And so that means I can put VB script or JavaScript inside of it, have it execute things like ActiveX objects to create a shell or run commands on the system. So I could run a batch file, I could run anything on the system a user could run, whoever's running it, I can run through our HTA here while still presenting them a pretty HTML page. So inside this HTA, I'm going to pack in a few things. First are some C# brains that are going to pretty much do all my payload staging. I'm going to have a batch file that's going to compile and execute my C#, and then I'm going to have the HTA that's going to deliver all of that to disk while presenting them this retirement invite. And as you can see, the evite thing I've created here, that's actually an open HTA application right now. That's the one we created for this phishing campaign. Looks, pretty legitimate. User opens it up. When they click on download, it says, Microsoft wants you to run this HTML application. They click yes, they get this screen. In the background, all of my code starts running. So walking through what that is, the evite.cs that I created is a basically C# script. If any of you guys were in the initial or Marcelo gave, he talked about using PowerShell without PowerShell briefly, the system management automation library. Well, that's what we're going to use. Is we're going to create a new run space and run some PowerShell code, and it's just going to run a PowerShell Empire stager. Has anyone used PowerShell Empire or familiar with it? We've got a few people in the room. So basically, PowerShell Empire, it's a C2 framework that takes you run a PowerShell command, it calls back out to your server, and then it just keeps beaconing out to your server and through HTTP or HTTPS and looking for new commands or PowerShell scripts to download and execute. So instead of calling PowerShell.exe, we're just going to bake that initial stager inside our evite.cs and go ahead and run it. We're also going to use install util to bypass AppLocker, because again, this is going to be compiled into an executable that's unsigned. So if AppLocker is blocking unsigned executables, well, I need to be able to get around that. Install util is a Microsoft utility on Windows workstations that is signed, again, Microsoft utility, that can run other executables if they have the uninstall class put into them. So that's what we're using the uninstall class for here. If I type install-util.exe and then evite.exe, once it's compiled, it's going to call this uninstall class, which is then going to run my connect to invite server code, which is basically my PowerShell Empire stager. And then the batch file that's going to be running, in order to compile it locally, I want to find csc.exe, which is in the .NET Framework folder, but I'm not sure what version's running there, so I have a batch file. It just kind of traverses through, finds where they have that file located, and then uses it to compile my code. It has to find the system management automation library to reference when it's compiling, and then it's got to find install-util.exe to use to execute my code. And then it's just going to start those. It's going to start the compile it, and then it's going to run it. And finally, we have all these things we've written. We need to get them on the user's disk. From an OPSEC perspective, we're putting things on disk. If an incident responder comes along, they can now reverse it. They can figure out what we're doing. So it's maybe not the safest method, but it's what we're working with here with our limited tool set and kind of trying to bypass some of the AV detections. And so we have our HTA payload. It's going to write our C# to disk. It's going to write that batch file you just saw to disk. Then it's going to execute the batch file, which is going to do the compiling and then execution of the payload. And eventually, we're good to go. We have our payload set. We have our evite.hta. Now we need to send it off. So we take our Chris Payne email. We send a link to, please go here to list website to RSVP if you're attending to the founder's retirement party or not. One of the things, you never want to attach an HTA directly in an email. Email box or scanners are going to block it. Also, if you attach a link or a path that goes directly to the HTA, most email scanners are smart enough to go, this is a link to a file, therefore it's a file, let me download it and analyze it first. So if you send them a link to a web page where they have to click a few buttons before they get to that file, you're not going to have the email scanner actually click those buttons and do that. Therefore, you kind of get past the email content gateway filters. And so we send it out late on Wednesday night and we wait.
Okay, so while Aaron was burning the midnight oil working late on Wednesday, I was asleep because I have a job and I have to go into work early in the morning. So I come in Thursday, get my coffee, go about my morning routine, responding to any maybe high-level alerts that need my attention first thing in the morning, and then I kind of settle into some routine queries and perusing of the logs that we do. Up on the screen here are a couple of items that I run through. We're not going to take the time to go through each and every one of these. These are just to give you some ideas of what type of activity I'm looking for through my EDR. And if you take a look at these, you're going to kind of realize that everything on here is going to be riddled with false positives and non-malicious activity. And you're right. if I do take the time, I'm going to get a ton of that. I'm going to spend a lot of time kind of weeding out on my network what is normal behavior and what is abnormal. And so over a period of time, you'll kind of establish that baseline. You'll filter out that normal activity. And this will become a smaller and smaller task each day over a period of months. One of the things that we're going to focus on here is the app blocker bypass list. There at the bottom is the list that I use. So there's a whole bunch of different binaries. One of them is install-util.exe. I just quickly run through the list and take a look for any use from this that I am not used to. I do have big spreadsheet filled with all the string queries that I'll do. I'll put them in there to filter out that baseline. And here you can see I have a log here for install-util.exe, invoking uninstall command for a binary and ctemp evite.exe. This is abnormal for me. I'm not aware of this application. We don't really execute binaries out of ctemp a whole lot. So because this is not part of that baseline, I'm going to take some time. I'm going to take follow the rabbit trail and see where this goes. So I don't know where it's at. So I'm going to grab the parent process ID for this command line execution. I'm going to stick it in and figure out, okay, maybe it'll tell me where it's from. And I do see another command line execution for the C# compiler, csc.exe, compiling this evite.exe from the code evite.cs, all within that ctemp directory. So I now know where the evite.exe binary came from, but I don't know where that C# code came from. So same process. Got the parent process ID, stick it in, and we see that the command line execution for evite.bat also. So once again, want to know where that bat file came from. I'll grab the parent process ID, and I can see that this retirement party evite.hta running out of the downloads folder is the binary that created that bat file, which then created the C# script, which then was used to compile that exe file. So I want to know where this file came from. It's in the downloads folder. Probably can guess it's from the internet. So I grab the parent process ID, and I can see which application it was used to download, and it looks like it is Chrome. One artifact here in this Chrome log that you can see, and kind of a detail about our network, is that we use safe links in email. This safe links protection will rewrite any URLs inside of the message body of the email and wrap it in this scanner engine. So when they click on that link, instead of going directly to the website, they are going through Microsoft Scan Engine, which is going to analyze the website before it lets them go through. If Microsoft deems malicious, it gets a big red screen that says, do not continue to this website. And then if it's fine, it just redirects them right away, and they don't know. I'm going to assume that because the URL that this download came from is wrapped in the safe links, that this was originally sent through a phishing email. So I'm going to test that hypothesis. I'm going to hop over to Office 365. I'm going to do a content search for any email in my mail environment that contains that safe links URL. And sure enough, get a couple of results. Looks like Chris Payne is the sender here, and he sent out this email. And if I click in, I can take a look at that email, and I can see, okay, standard, oh, he's having a retirement party, he sits over there. I know he's having that retirement party. And I have a URL down at the bottom, cpayne-retirementefites.net. I'm going to assume that is where that HTA came from. And so I want a copy of that HTA. I kind of want to know, where this email was, give me some more details about it. So I'm going to hop over to my sandbox. I'm going to visit the website, and it looks like this website is down. So no luck getting the HTA over there. Hop over to Microsoft Message Header Analyzer tool I am a fan of, and I stick the message headers in, and it kind of just parses it out. Makes it a lot easier than scrolling through that in Notepad, which I find to be very annoying. And I can see that this is a legitimate email. It did originate from my mail server to my mail server. It's not a spoof or anything like that, so Chris Payne is indeed actually the sender. But I still want a copy of that HTA file. The only place I know that has it is that end user's box where I saw those process logs executing. So I'm going to hop over to my EDR, which has a remote shell. And when I go over to that ctemp directory, I'm met with a lovely surprise. There's a lot of items here that I was not previously aware of. Now you'll know this is my Thursday morning, and this takes time. I'm not going to like chunk one query into my EDR, and the first thing I find is when I go down on a rabbit hole. I'm going to go through a few of those lines. Maybe I'll go down a rabbit hole to deem it's not malicious, and then go continue on my day. So it looks like there has been some activity on this box. I don't know what it is. I especially love that folder called pivot. And it's at this time where I go, yeah, this is probably malicious, but I work for a corporation, so before I go into full incident responder mode, I need to witness malicious activity. I need to see malicious code. I can't just, like, oh, I have a hunch, let's go kill that server. I might not have a job. So we're going to go ahead and download all of these local to the box for some analysis. Now, you'll notice I connected to a box that I was investigating. I did this through my EDR's credentialless shell. It is a very common practice for attackers to monitor for connections to workstations or to servers and try to intercept those credentials. So if you are doing any type of investigation, it's very important, don't RDP into a server with your domain creds. You use a credentialless shell with an EDR tool that you may have or may be getting soon. Or a lot of times the help desk remote assistance software does not use credentials to be able to connect to a box, so you can piggyback off their infrastructure. And if you don't have an option like that, you can use credentials local to the workstation. If it is infected, any credentials local to that workstation, you can probably already assume are compromised. So if you pass them credentials they already have, not a big deal, especially if they can't use those to pivot. So use something like Microsoft Labs in order to do that connection if you absolutely must pass creds. Okay, so I have a busy day, and I don't manually reverse engineer every single binary file that comes across my computer screen. So I use a tool called hybrid analysis. There's a ton of these. You can have there's public ones, there's private sandboxes that you can get. And what these do is you can just chuck a suspicious or malicious binary into this. It will run it in a sandbox, and it'll analyze it, give you a whole bunch of indicators that you can use to pivot off an investigation. So here we have kind of a SecOps break. If you're using a public sandbox like this, attackers watch these. If they develop a payload for your environment, they have the hash values, and they're going to be monitoring to see if those hash values are in that environment. This is the first time they'd probably say, hey, they're on to me. They'll either go into stasis, or if they're jerks like this guy here, he might burn the whole environment down. If you don't have an internal sandbox that you can do this type of, you can purchase these services where they're not public facing, not queryable, and they're just for your company alone and for the sandbox. While I'm letting hybrid analysis do the heavy lifting on that evite.exe file, I'm going to come over and I'm going to take a look at this C# script. Now, I'm not a full-time programmer, but it doesn't take a whole lot to take a look at this code and realize that no sober programmer wrote this. And just a couple of minutes here, maybe like 2 minutes, I can see this is just nonsensical math up top. The uninstall class just invokes one class, which is right below. And if I take a look at that class, I have two base 64 encoded variables, or it looks like one big base 64 encoded string that was split into two, and then the line at the very bottom there, or one up from the bottom there, it just concatenates those two variables together and then decodes them. This is not normal practice for our developers. I'm not aware of it being widely adopted, so when I see stuff like this, I kind of assume it's malicious, and we'll take. I'm going to pop over to look at that ssh.vbs file that we also saw in that ctemp directory. It's a quick VB script, and it looks right here. It just uses wscript shell to use ssh.exe. along with a key file and tunnel out to an IP. So I'm going to grab, binary names, port numbers. I'm going to grab the key file, IP addresses, file hashes. These are all indicators you're going to write down. I'm going to set them to the side. Going over to that cdmp.ps1 file. I open that up, and anyone familiar with PowerShell Empire will immediately recognize this as the Chrome dump script, still fully commented and unedited directly off their GitHub page. So getting a little concerned here because it looks like there is actually malicious activity. And somewhere between, looking at the email and now, I've moved into hunting and into incident response. So, I want to see if that script was successful, and if I look at that cdmp.txt file that was in the directory, it looks like it was. Have a nice list here full of plain text credentials and the URLs that the attacker can use with them. So, excellent. Not that I need the hybrid analysis results to identify this activity as malicious, but here's the results from hybrid analysis that come in. It's got a 45 out of 100. No AV vendors have determined it was, malicious. I'm sure all of you are fully staffed and have all of the time that you need to do full and track down every minor thing, but for one of those SOCs that are not fully staffed or, are a little busy, this probably would get passed over if all they do is hybrid analysis and they'll move on with their day. So, I know it's malicious, and some of you guys may work in an environment where, rogue employees are a major concern for you. I don't, and if I see an employee's email account sending out malicious phishes, I don't assume it's the employee trying to do that type of activity, but I kind of assume that his account has been compromised. So the first thing I'm going to do is try to purge that malicious email out of my environment, and then I'm going to go see if my hypothesis on his account being compromised is correct. So connect to the Security and Compliance Center for Office 365 with PowerShell, and I can do what's called a content search purge. Earlier I did a content search where I gathered all those phishing emails up from that URL. Now I can say purge that from my mail server completely. It will remove it from every instance, but still keep it in an isolated spot, that security, that content search, so that I can continue to grab and download for samples, or if I wanted to go back and take a look at it. Next, to take a look at the account activity, I'm going to go head over to Azure Active Directory for my Office 365 environment, which is actually where the authentication logs for Office 365 are stored. Now, like Aaron said, not all SIEMs work to ingest this, or maybe your EPS licensing isn't able to bring this type of information in because you're too busy trying to meet PCI compliance or something like that. Luckily they do allow you to download these logs into a nice CSV file. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that, and you see this is what it looks like. Lots of different things that we can run good searches on. You got source IP, user agent, strings, authentication results. Now you could search through this by hand. That would take way too long, and I'm way too lazy to do that. So I wrote a PowerShell script that will just churn through the logs, filter out the known good IPs like our headquarter office or remote offices, where I do expect a lot of authentication failures from multiple user accounts to happen. And then I will churn through, find any IP address that for each failure log that has attempted to log into more than one user account and has greater than 10 failures. And then I'll take all those IP addresses, I'll rerun through all the successful logs, and I'll spit out any email address and IP address that has had a successful login. So when I run this script, sure enough, painc@bezinc.com, it looks like it was from one of those attacker IP addresses and was able to successfully log in. So suspicion confirmed. So I'm going to clean that up. First, I'm going to reset the password in Active Directory. I'm going to hop into Office 365. They now have this in the GUI, or you can still do it in PowerShell to revoke all OAuth keys across the board. So any client that has authenticated to that account will be forced to re-authenticate post-password reset. I'll send a ticket over to the help desk to assist the user with getting all his devices and everything back on. I'm going to send that Chrome dump script over so they can, make sure all his personal stuff isn't hosed tomorrow. Also, a common attacker technique is to forward all copy of all mails out to an external, so external email. So even if they lose access to the mailbox, they still have full eyes on any type of communication that may happen. And believe it or not, help desk do send the passwords for resets to an email. So that's like a thing. Amazing. So yeah, so I'm going to review those, make sure there isn't anything fishy going on there. Going to just spot check his sent mail, make sure he didn't send any other fishes out. And I'm going to spot check his activity logs, make sure he isn't up to anything else. So after doing all that, we look good. So initial ingress cleaned up, back to racking out the rest of the activity. And I originally started with, one log at a time, taking the parent process ID, chucking it in, and kind of mapping this out by hand. And that takes a lot of time. And when you're trying to, spin up and justify threat hunting in your environment, which you do get a lot of value from, is really hard to sell it when you're like, yes, that one guy will spend all day, every day, just manually going through logs. It's probably not going to sell. And so where you focus on tooling really matters. Most EDR products come, help you with that. And they come with something like this, where you can just right-click on any one of those logs anywhere in the entire activity chain, and you can draw out a process tree like this. And you can see here, this is what it looks like for these logs that I was looking at earlier. So let's take a look and see what we got. So this is the initial log, install-util.exe, executing that evite.exe file. Moving up, I can see HTA execution, and over on the right-hand side, you can see that they have files written to disk, that evite.bat. Going up the tree, I can see the parent processes of Chrome, which invoked the download, and I can also see that Chrome was launched from Outlook. So here we can see that csc.exe is compiling evite.exe. And here we get some new activity. We can see that a scheduled task being created called Feel the Pain, and it's referencing feelthepain.vbs in ctemp. Next, I can see PowerShell executing that Chrome dump script. I can see task kill, killing process ID. And then I can see that Chrome dump script executing again. But then all activity stops. So I'm going to take a look at the event timeline and see what I can do. So chuck that install-util.exe into the event timeline that my EDR provides, and I can see there's a lot of activity for that binary. Last night, and then over on the right-hand side, after a long period of no activity, I see some activity turning up again. I'm somewhere in this green blob of activity time period over on the right, but I have been investigating everything over on the left. So, quick recap. Up until now, looks like we had a successful password spray on Office 365 where an attacker popped credentials for Chris Payne, sent out a phish from the user's mailbox, and it looks like we had an end user, Somerville T, click on that phish and open a shell. It appears that they were off-premise while doing that. It looks like the attacker was setting up persistence via scheduled task, and it looks like the attacker was successful at dumping the stored credentials from the end user's Chrome browser. And then all activity stops, most likely due because the machine being powered off because it was nighttime. So I then cleaned up the phish, the initial point of ingress, did the password resets, thank you help desk, and it appears I have new activity this morning that I still need to map out. But I will hand it over to Aaron before we get to that.
All right, so Tom obviously ran through a lot more than I had showed with the payload. I mean, made the payload, I sent it out, but I got a phish. So we let him run through some detection stuff. We're going to backtrack and do a little flashback to show what was actually happening on the red team side. We sent the email out. We sent it out late at night. And what do you know? A shell came back that night. Looks like they had a good employee who decided to work from home on his corporate laptop. Works for me. I guess I get a shell. I'm going to start hacking until it goes away. First thing, I get a shell, comes through. I need to make sure my persistence is set up. One poor thing I did in my operational setup was that I didn't have an auto persistence run on my initial beachhead shell, or my stage 1. So I need to go ahead and establish that. Poor planning, I'm rushing. I'm just going to go with SCH tasks likely, as we saw from Tom's stuff there. But we see in our shell real quick that it's executed by install-util. This is the Empire C2 listener here, and it's telling me basically the shell is running as Somerville T is the username that's running under process name install-util. It's not running as an admin, and we can also see the IP masked out, but it came from a home IP address. It wasn't from the Besnik network that we were expecting. And so it ran on this machine, but I guess we're at home. We're not going to be able to do domain lateral movement or anything. So let's see what we can find about this local host right now. So again, we're rushing for persistence at this point because we should have set it up before. It's one of those obfusc fails, and so we go with creating a quick scheduled task. And we're going to use our Feel the Pain VBS is what we end up putting on disk because we have our batch file that can run to run our shell that the HTA made. But if you try to run a batch file on Windows outside of using something like VBScript, on Windows 10 especially, you can't get rid of the black box that's going to pop up. There's no hiding it. So we can use VBScript to do a wscript.shell, which will go ahead and execute it in a hidden background window. And so we create our feelthepain.vbs, we drop it on disk, and then we set up the scheduled task to run our batch file. After we have our persistence, we know it's going to call back each day for us. We're not on the local network, so again, it's not like I can do any domain recon. They weren't VPN'd in, it didn't look like, so I'm just going to figure out what this host has and what I can use on this host. Is there any next-gen AV running? Let's get the AV provider. Let's get some information about the current software and processes running. Are there any exploitable services for local privilege escalation since the user is not a local admin? Are there any scheduled tasks we could abuse, or any DLLs we could hijack to try and elevate our privileges? Check for patches, but overall, didn't find any of that. We had been looking for it, but we didn't find it. We did see there was a next-gen AV running though, and EDR product. So if we don't have any way to get to local admin, well, option would be to get off this box. Usually, once you compromise a host as well, you don't want to sit on the host that you phished because eventually they might catch on. It's like your hotspot host, I guess. It's, you don't want to rob a bank and then just sit inside. Once you get inside, you want to get out, go somewhere else, go hide. So as an attacker, I'm going to get on the box and I need to get off to somewhere else and then establish persistence on the new host I've gotten access to and then work out of that one to further lateral move inside the network. But I need a way to do that with credentials, and I don't have this user's credentials. And so I wanted to get the user's credentials that I'm currently logged in as, and so I decided to use Chrome dump. From Chrome dump, I'm going to find all the websites he's logged into, what credentials he's used, if he stored passwords in the browser, and run that. But one of the things I ran into as an issue, the Empire module wasn't working, and I couldn't just call it. I could use IEX to download from the internet and run the PowerShell script, so I didn't have to put it on disk. But IEX is pretty often flagged when you're downloading something over the internet. And so I know the Chrome dump script is not like running a Mimikatz script or some of the more malicious ones. It's usually not flagged. Not sure why, but a lot of AV vendors aren't looking directly at this one. So I test it in my sandbox and then decide to just upload it directly to this host and run it without using noisy things like an IEX download to invoke in memory. And so I upload it there. Didn't modify it that much, though. I just changed the name. Maybe that's something that, as a more mature red team would do is modify the script, write their own, change variables inside of it so it's not so obviously Chrome dump. But in this case, no, we just opted to run quick. So one of those, again, OPSEC fails I was talking about. And then one of the other things is Chrome dump can't run when Chrome is running because it needs to spin up an instance of the browser attached to it and pull a key out of memory so that we can take and extract that information from the database and decrypt it. So we have to kill the user's instance of Chrome since they're running it. So we quickly kill it, run Chrome dump, and then start Chrome again for them. So they think, Chrome must have just crashed or something. Hopefully they don't look into it too much if you do it quick enough. And then once we have our output file, we download chromedump.txt and see we have passwords in there. And we know it's the user's domain password because it's stored for the login microsoftonline.com, so their O365 deployment. And now we've got Somerville T's creds, and let's see what we can do with them. And then as we kept working to look at the host, our shell goes away. I mean, it was late at night. I guess employees have to sleep too. I guess red teamers don't usually do that, but standard employees, whatever. So yeah, no shell. Hopefully we get it back the next day.
Okay, so back to when I was talking, but fast forward from when Aaron was talking, immediately following the last time that I talked. We're going to take a look at that activity that I saw pop back up in the morning. So first thing I'm going to do, I was looking at install-util.exe, so I'm going to draw out the process tree for the activity, and sure enough, I do see some child processes from that binary. And taking a look, I see another scheduled task called painful proxy being created. And it calls that ssh.vbs script, and if you remember earlier this morning, we had looked at it and it made a tunnel out to that remote IP. I see a couple of uses of net here, trying to mount the C drive to a remote dev server. You can see the IP address here. And then here it looks like the attacker was successful after a few attempts at mounting that. Now, but then there's no activity other than just that little bit. And if I take a look at the start date, start timestamp and the end timestamp of all this activity, it looks here that it's all took place over a 2-hour period. Like I said, this does not happen at the speed of light. You know, you do a couple things, you're taking logs, sometimes people walk up to your desk and interrupt you, hopefully not when you're in IR mode. But I do remember that he created that scheduled task for that SSH script, so it's reason to believe if he took the time to set that up, maybe he did that for a better tool set. He was having trouble with his initial shell. So I'm going to pivot out, and I'm going to take a look for any additional logs that may be interacting with the SSH script, and we can see that W script shell, you know, using that VBS script. I'm going to draw up that process tree. Now, I do see over on the right, in really small text at the bottom right-hand corner, you know, we have network activity to a remote IP over port 22, as expected. But I also see my first sign of lateral movement, and this IP address matches the IP address that to that dev server that the attacker was trying to mount the C drive to, and it's over 3389. So my assumption here is that he is using RDP to this server. So I'm going to hop over and I'm going to take a look for any of these indicators. I got IP addresses, file names, file hashes. I've got binary names. I've got activity such as install, calling uninstall command. I'm going to run through all these things that I've gathered up against that dev server, see if I see the attacker acting over there. And sure enough, I do see install-util.exe, executing evite.exe, running on the dev server. So let's draw that process tree up and take a look at what we got. I do see that he is attempting to use that same binary in order to, you know, call out, I assume, to his infrastructure. But I don't see any network apps actually being created. It looks like for some reason, you know, he's trying but failing. So not sure why. I feel like I'm catching up. I feel like since I see him reusing, you know, his TPPs, I'm going to, you know, try to make my move, see if I can hurdle him and herd him out of my network.
All right, that's long to read. Basically, we're coming back to, you know, I lost my shell that night. I got up the next morning. He's already triaged a little past this part because, you know, he's running a little ahead of our time. So let's go back and see what was going on. Well, that morning, like clockwork, I got my shell back. You know, the Wednesday night, I had sent out the fish. I was trying to get access. Someone opened it. I was in their laptop for a couple hours. It was at home. Nope. Wow. Thursday morning, they go in. I get access to the internal company network. You see the internal IP change there a little bit. And so now I'm running back on their laptop because my scheduled task called back. So things to check. I've already done a lot of my host-based reconnaissance. There's not much more I'm going to do there. But I want to get off of this host. Like I said, I'm in a hot seat right here, and I just need to get out of it. Let's try and get onto another host in the network, preferably a server, something that's going to stay up. You know, it's not subject to employee schedules. You know, a server that might be commonly calling back to the internet, if I can, would be preferable. You know, you want to blend in with traffic, but we're going to take what we're given. And so start looking for active network connections that this laptop might make to the network. We're going to do some domain recon, try and find fully qualified domain names to understand what servers are out there, because admins love to name their internal servers like sharepoint.bezinc.com or some internal network. You can just go off of domain names to try and find that. I love passwordmanager.bezinc.com, things like that. Just helps me out as an attacker, makes my life easier. Get a search for sensitive documents on any shares that we're connected to. Look for things that might be run by another server. Sometimes there's, you know, scripts that might get run by servers that user could have write access to. I'm going to look to see if there's any passwords stored in group policy preferences, you know, stored out there in a Windows environment. And then service principal names. See if I can get their hashes through Kerber roasting techniques and then try and crack those hashes. But you know, those are some steps. We're not going to go through them, all of them, but some things I would do. So one thing we came across that was interesting here in our single attack chain is that Somerville T, he was a member of the Bezinc VS IAS 01 group. Very common to see companies put their global group memberships pretty much the same as a server name that they're saying this user has access to. You know, principle of least privilege, obviously. You don't want every user to have admin to every server or workstation or access to them, so you assign them groups. And, oh, a little too loud. Sorry. You assign them groups. But with those groups, they probably have access to it. And as an attacker, I'm going to look at it and go, perfect, that's a good group if I can find a server that correlates to it. And sure enough, in my domain name recon, I found out vsiso1.bezing.com. Well, I have a domain group this user's a part of, and a server that matches that name. And you know, this is our hypothetical situation, but this is something that happens pretty often on our real-world engagements. So not just blowing smoke here to make an easy attack chain. So once we have that, I want to pivot to it. I'm going to guess this user has access to it. But right now, all I can do is I'm running commands through a shell that's basically using HTTP and HTTPS. There's no persistent connection here. It's only connecting back out to me every 30 seconds, calling back to run a command for me, and then giving me the output. So it's not like I can RDP. It's not like I can SSH into the server. So instead, I'm going to try, sorry. That's, good? Good, okay. So I'm going to try and use SSH.exe, Microsoft Signed Binary, because OpenSSH project, they were trying to import SSH into Windows. A lot of you probably on Windows 10. Have you guys used SSH now on Windows, now that it's native in everyone's Windows 10 deployment? Did anyone know SSH is now native to their Windows 10 deployment? They're on the latest patches. It's awesome. But we wrote this talk right before that was possible, so I had to drop SSH.exe to disk. But with my luck, it's still Microsoft Signed Binary, because they were working on it in dev at that time. And what I'm going to do is from the laptop, I'm going to do a reverse dynamic SOCKS 5 proxy out to a jump box in the internet. I have a jump box this user can get into that's restricted. And so when the laptop calls out to it, what's going to happen is it's going to create a tunnel that's over port 90. Well, it goes out over port 22 to SSH to my server, opens up this tunnel and opens up a listening interface on my server that's port 9050. And anything that goes into port 9050 on my server gets tunneled over that SSH connection into the laptop and then out the laptop into the network. So it's a reverse SOCKS 5 proxy chain using SSH. And then for my attacker box, I'm going to SSH into that jump box, forwarding all traffic from my attacker box to port 9050 on the jump box, which then goes into the network. And therefore, I have a full tunnel to pivot into their network. So first, I got to get that to run. So I'm going to upload our OpenSSH.exe. I'm going to unzip my package that I dropped there. Once I unzip it, I need to modify the keys. I use SSH keys from the laptop to jump out to my Bastion host. Obviously, I'm putting keys on his laptop, so the host here is a burner box. The blue team finds them. They'll be able to use them to get to the server. But just to annoy him, I two-factored it as well. So it's like they can get to them, but it's not much that's going to happen. But on top of that, the user account is fully restricted. It doesn't get a shell. I'm not naive. People can break out of those user restrictions. But the server, if they get into it, I'm not terribly concerned because it's a complete burner box. So from that perspective, it gives me my jump back. And I have to change the keys here, though, change their permissions so that the keys will work with SSH keys and or with SSH. And then I'm going to run it. And I'm going to use a VB script to run it so that it hides the black prompt window. And then I'm going to execute it from a scheduled task just to detach it from the current process that I'm running it under. So it's not directly running under the install util program. And after that, I can use proxy chains to go ahead and pivot into the network. So I use proxy chains with enum for Linux just to kind of do some domain reconnaissance to verify that it works and get back a list of user accounts, a list of domain information. But that's going straight into their domain controller. The 1030.016 is their domain controller, and my proxy chains configuration is set up on my attacker box to forward all that traffic through the proxy tunnel we established. And then after that, we can use RDP with proxy chains. So now we're RDPing into that server that we thought we had access to through that user account based on them being a part of that group. Sure enough, we do. We have access to the server, and we have an RDP session. With our RDP session open, I need to get scripts onto that server. So one thing I'm going to do here is try and use SMB client through my initial shell or through proxy chains to connect to it. It mounts the share, and then I'm going to drop my payload script that I had been running before on the workstation over on that server so I can run it and get a connection out from that server so I'm not pivoting through this workstation anymore. So I start setting that up, and then I use crackmap exec just to execute it instead of calling it through my RDP session so that hopefully it stays open even when I close my RDP session. and I come up with an error. For some reason, my payload doesn't want to run on this 2012 server. Probably one of those OPSEC fails. That's why you always kind of clone your environment out when you're attacking it. You don't rush through it. You make sure you have a clone of who you're attacking, and you test all your tools out there. Wasn't tested here. There was some error with my payload. Just doesn't like the .NET runtime version they've got. Who knows? And so before we spend our time triaging, I'm in panic mode now as an attacker. Things are not quite going my way. I need to go a little quick. So I'm just going to try and get credentials and maybe hold some persistence and get onto other servers. As an attacker, once I get rushed, I'm going to start making more mistakes. You try to move quick and you're not too silent. So one of the things I do here is I'm going to try and dump LSA, or I'm going to dump SAM, and get the local admin creds off of that machine. And so,
okay. So while Aaron has been playing around the server, I think I should kick him out before he gets too far into our network. So immediately following the last time that I talked, during his last talk, I got confused. Picking up where I left off, I'm going to try to get him out of the network here. So I got a bunch of different indicators, IP addresses, binary names, everything. I know kind of how he's been acting. I've seen him use the same techniques on multiple boxes in the network. So I'm going to take those indicators and then back out. I'm going to filter out the computers I know he's already compromised, and I'm going to send these through my logs and see if I see any of this activity happening anywhere else in my network. So going through the EDR, looking for activity at that IP address, I see none. So it looks like all that activity to and from the attacker in my network is going through that one workstation that I know is compromised. Just to confirm that, make sure you didn't pivot out to unmanaged assets like an IoT device or a security camera, or I'm sure all of your endpoint teams hit 100% on your endpoint agents all of the time. But just in case they missed one or two, I can go through my firewall logs or go into NetFlow, and I can do the same thing. And here I can see in my firewall no activity to that IP address from any other devices. I can also take a look at some of the other protocols he was using. I know he used SSH. I know that he was using RDP. So I'm going to take a look for any RDP activity from that compromised workstation to any other device, and I do only see activity to that server. So I feel like the attacker has not gotten too far. He's communicating through that workstation, and it looks like he's pivoted out to that dev server, but that's about it. So what am I going to do? Well, most EDRs come with a fancy-dancy little network contain. You can click a button and you can kill all network activity on the device that has that endpoint. Mine does that, so I'm going to hit that network contain button, and this is going to kill all communication to and from that workstation, except from my EDR environment. So I'll continue to get logs, and I'll still have that remote shell to the workstation. Next, I can blacklist them, the IP address, fully qualified domain names into our firewall, and I want to make sure that I do all this as simultaneously as possible. What I don't want to do is be wrong, or move slow, maybe just kill that server. The attacker realizes that, oh, hey, they're on to me, and he blows up CryptoLocker on the workstation. Yep. So after I have finished kicking the attacker out of the network, now I have a little more time to breathe, maybe, a little more time to breathe and go into that post-incident analysis. Now, we were going to go and, it was just as long as the talk has been so far on this. We can consolidate it down this slide, but you see here that if I were to do this post-incident analysis, the forensics on the device, the logs that it gives me, an EDR is very helpful for this. And you can see the attacker trying to dump SAM and do a hash dump on the dev server. So that would have been cleaned up, and I can take all those credentials, assume they're compromised, and get all that cleaned up well. So recap.
All right, it's a bit of a recap. From the red team here, obviously some lesson learned from a red team perspective. One, test your payloads in all your environments before you run them. But the second one there is maybe I shouldn't have been running that payload on the server. I had already used it as my initial payload to run on the workstation. He's obviously already caught it. Even if I had gotten it to run on that server and he hadn't seen my lateral movement to that server, had he just taken that payload hash and checked it in the environment to see if anywhere else had executed or installed and had that there, he'd find the same signatures. So as a red team, a good thing to do is once you've landed your beachhead, your stage 1 payloads, you get into a workstation, those are burnable. You're expecting those to be burned. You're constantly working on new ones. But once you're starting to move laterally and you're establishing your remote access toolkit and your slow callbacks and your persistence as well, you're going to want to use a different payload for your persistence when you get on that server. Or that other workstation, and that's going to call back with maybe a long poll. You can maybe use like a DNS type callback to maybe just check for a command every hour to run in case you lose your rat. And then the next step is you're going to install or establish a rat toolkit on that server or host so that you can use that in the future to do more operations without having to upload all these files to disk and get really noisy. But that needs to be a really flushed out toolkit and framework. So sometimes it's hard to work with whatever is open source out there. Like if you're just working with an Empire framework, it's known. The TTPs for how that operates are known. So having your own custom toolkit as a red team can be pretty helpful, especially when you're trying to keep like an OPSEC perspective so it doesn't all get burned. And don't rush as the red team. Have everything strategically planned out so that you don't get in that situation where you're trying to pivot and you're frantically doing it and then you make mistakes and get caught.
Okay. And for blue team, I think the biggest takeaway we wanted you to get is that you do not need to have, all the bells and whistles, a fully tooled environment. Just with the, implementation of one tool, and most EDR products are fairly easy to implement. You can do quite a bit. So all this was done pretty much with just the EDR. I did quickly take a look at NetFlow and Firewall just to confirm what my EDR had told me. I'm sure most of you guys have Firewall and hopefully Firewall logs. Yeah, you don't need, millions of dollars of investment in 5 years to tool before you can do this activity. Start it now, see how it works in your environment. Also, all the other IT teams, they have a lot of tools that help them. Your network team probably has a NetFlow implementation, and your help desk team probably has the remote assistance software, like I mentioned with the credentialless shell. So other teams' tools are your team's tools too. Hopefully. So maybe borrow them for a bit until you can stand up your own infrastructure. Also, you can get a lot of value from doing this, even if you fumble through it just like 2 hours a week. You will learn a lot about your environment. You're going to learn about your norms, you're going to learn about your blind spots, and it's going to help you better secure your organization, even if you actually don't find Aaron. And then also, start small, start noisy. If you're doing, red, blue, purple exercises against your own organization, you don't want to stick the world's best red teamer against a brand new hunter, right? Like it's like shooting fish in a barrel. Like he's going to win, and they usually win anyways. So, give yourself a chance. Do leave some indicators that they're going to find, and then you can slowly and incrementally increase the complexity of those exercises as you get more practice or you get your infrastructure better hashed out. And then also, if you think you can benefit from this type of activity, you're really like, man, I can't even spend 2 hours a week doing this. Most EDR and the next-gen AV products that generate these types of logs, they have some type of managed hunting service, They're not perfect. They come with their flaws. They come with their delays. But you can see here this exact attack chain that we just went through. My EDR product caught this a couple days later through their managed hunt service. So while we weren't caught, through the automated detection, the humans in California somewhere, the sock monkeys, they did alert me to this. So better late than never. And then I can go through that just in instant response mode. So these are some things that you could use as a crutch until you are able to actually do it yourself in a more reasonable amount of time. So that's all we have. Any questions? Yes.
You talked about identifying it, finding it. You talked about the incident, but you didn't mention, at what point, would you say, hey, I've definitely determined this is an incident. What's the trigger point?
Yeah.
You have your own incident response team, and how would you do that and determine, whether you want to just focus on how much damage is there, or do you want to prosecute, or I don't know.
So during the talk, let's see if we go somewhere up here, you'll see somewhere between me trying to figure out what this email is and me seeing this folder structure called pivot, and then definitely if that hasn't triggered my hunting to IR transition, seeing the Chrome dump script. So it's somewhere between, you know, funny binary, not incident response. We're still hunting, we're doing that investigation. Okay, oddly named malicious folders called pivot with a whole bunch of scripts in ctemp. That might trigger IR for some companies, but if that doesn't trigger it, definitely the moment I open up the text file in that folder, well, that will trigger it. So it's going to be a little different between every organization where that handoff is. In my environment, the handoff is from me to me. So I just keep going on through. I'm doing the hunting, and I've turned it into IR mode. So it's not rigid, like I found something, have fun. And then that's how I recommend it. Put your incident responders, whoever is looking, who would clean up an actual attack like this in your environment, have them start that hunting if you don't have an HR that's generous enough to just give you a new FTE to do this dedicated. Yes?
You mentioned testing out your tools and your payloads beforehand.
Yep.
So do you just have like a bunch of general like environments that you test, or do you go through, see, oh, here's what I might be dealing with, let's go build some of those environments to test there?
Yeah, both of those actually. So in a perfect scenario, when I have a lot more time for recon, I'm going to try and figure out what their environment looks like a little bit more. I have custom payloads I've developed that basically run, and their purpose isn't to get me a shell, it's to do recon for me and exfil it to a burner box, and I don't care if those get caught. I'll be sending those out. I'll try and figure out and fingerprint their environment, their AV products, their EDRs, everything I can possibly find about it, what server versions they have out there. Once all that's done and I have my recon, I might stay dormant for a little while I build out an environment that matches theirs, do all my testing in it, and then I'll be ready to go and actually attack it. But I also do have a lab that has your generics. It's going to have, you know, your Windows Server 2012 and 2016, and then Windows 7 and 10, things like that. So I'll still test in those as well, but you really do want to figure out their environment by some means beforehand. And also, if you do some recon externally, they have external servers that you see, and you see all of them are like a 2012 server, then you know, okay, it looks like their environment's about at this level. I should test most of my stuff in that type of environment. So.
Okay. We'll be outside. Unfortunately, we're out of time to
Yep.
take more questions, but you can hit us up out there if you do have more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.